I'm having a hard time picking up Anwar's signal. It stopped here, at the statue. Micah, what's wrong?
Elsie just found it. Shots of him. Anwar. The cigarette.
No. He's dead?
We should go collect his remains.
We'll go right away. I'm so sorry, Micah.
Me too, Ghost.
Hey, kid. Why don't I come down and meet you? We can chat about whatever. Anything, your pick.
Thank you, Kate.
Turtle, how many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop?
In rural Chesterfield County, Virginia, during the scorching July of 1847, a tobacco plantation owner discovered something in his weathered barn that would force an entire community to confront the darkest contradictions of their society. What Abraham Sutherland found that afternoon, his 23-year-old son living in secret with 3 enslaved women and their children, would lead to one of the most controversial public ceremonies ever recorded in antebellum Virginia of records. The county clerk documented the event with trembling hands, noting that what transpired in the town square defies all custom and law, yet was witnessed by no fewer than 400 souls. For over a century, descendants of those who stood in that square have refused to speak of what they saw, and the official marriage certificates, plural, remain sealed in a private family vault, their contents known only to a handful of historians who swore never to reveal the full details. What you're about to hear is the true story of how one man's attempt to control his legacy created a scandal that nearly tore a county apart. A story pieced together from private letters, plantation records, and sworn testimonies that were deliberately excluded from public archives. Before we continue with the story of the Southern Thurland Plantation and what really happened in that barn, if you're fascinated by the hidden and disturbing chapters of American history, the ones they don't teach in schools, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest corners of the past. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? What hidden stories from your state or city should we uncover next? Now let's return to that sweltering Virginia afternoon in 1847. When everything Abraham Southern Thurland believed about his family was about to crumble. The truth is, what Abraham discovered that day had been building for years, hidden in plain sight on the very land he believed he controlled completely. Chesterfield County in 1847 sat at the heart of Virginia's tobacco empire, a patchwork of plantations stretching along the Appomattox River, where the soil still yielded gold in the form of bright leaf tobacco. The Southern Thurland estate, known locally as Hollywood, sprawled across 800 acres of prime bottom land, worked by 42 enslaved people whose labor had built the family's fortune over 3 generations. The main house, a federal-style manor with 4 wide columns, stood on a gentle rise overlooking fields that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the tree end. Behind it, a cluster of outbuildings formed their own small village, the kitchen house, smokehouse, dairy, and at the farthest edge of the compound, a massive tobacco barn barn with walls weathered to the color of old pewter. Abraham Sutherland was 58 years old that summer, a man whose rigid posture and precisely trimmed gray beard reflected his view of the world as something that could and should be ordered according to strict principles. He'd inherited Hollow Crest from his father and expanded it methodically, purchasing adjacent properties and additional slaves with the calculated precision of someone playing chess. His wife, Catherine, had died 6 years earlier of consumption, leaving him with their only child, a son named Thomas, who'd always seemed too gentle for the world. Abraham was preparing him to inherit. Thomas Sutherland had turned 23 that spring, tall and lean, with his mother's dark eyes, and a quiet manner that his father often mistook for weakness. He'd been educated at a private academy in Richmond, studying agriculture and business as Abraham intended, but he'd returned to Hollowcrest 2 years earlier with what his father called impractical notions about modernizing their operations. They argued frequently about crop rotation, about purchasing new equipment, about the efficiency of their labor management. Abraham saw these disagreements as real pains. Son would eventually understand that the old ways worked because they were right. What Abraham didn't know was that Thomas had stopped sleeping in the main house 18 months earlier. The arrangement had begun innocuously enough.
Johnson, what's the motive looking like in here?
Who are you guys? Forensics team is all planned and we call it Black Ops 7. We're the replacement. Oh my God! Is that anybody?
No, he's napping.
Hey, Rip. Do they still call us Rip?
Yeah, they do.
Do we have kids?
We have 2 great boys. One of them is named Jet.
Man, we are obsessed with flying. Do we get to work with planes?
So you do have a career in aviation, and we get to do something pretty cool.
Like what?
We're working with Shell to develop sustainable aviation fuel.
We're making fuels from things that you didn't know you could.
Like leftover agricultural products.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Any advice?
I do wish you would have gotten a haircut, though, from back in the day. It's a pretty ridiculous style.
Thomas had convinced his father that he needed to supervise the tobacco curing more closely, that the delicate process of transforming green leaves into marketable product required constant attention during the critical weeks of late summer. He moved a cot into the small office attached to the curing barn, insisting he needed to monitor temperature and humidity through the night. Abraham had approved this show of dedication, even bragging to neighboring planters that his son was finally showing proper commitment to the family business, but Thomas hadn't been monitoring tobacco. In the main section of that barn, behind stacks of wooden hogsheads and hanging bundles of leaf, Thomas had created something that would have been incomprehensible to his father, a home. He'd partitioned off a section with salvaged lumber, installed a small stove for cooking and heat, brought in proper furniture piece by piece under cover of darkness, and he'd been living there with 3 women who officially belonged to his father. Sarah, 25 years old, who'd worked in the main house as a seamstress. Rebecca, 22, assigned to the dairy, and Mary, just 20, who'd been trained as a cook. By the summer of 1847, Sarah had given birth to a 2-year-old boy. Rebecca was nursing an infant daughter, and Mary was 6 months pregnant. The women hadn't been stolen away or hidden by force. Each had come to that barn willingly, drawn by Thomas's quiet promises of something different, something better. He'd taught them to read using his mother's old books. He'd convinced the plantation's overseer, a man named Dutch Ricks, who owed Thomas a significant gambling debt, to alter the work schedules so the women could spend nights away from the slave quarters without raising immediate suspicion. Thomas had even been setting aside money, keeping detailed records in a leather journal of every dollar he saved, planning for some distant future when he might buy their freedom and escape Virginia entirely. It was a fantasy, of course, built on the unstable foundation of youth and desperation. And like all such fantasies in the antebellum South, it was destined to collapse. The discovery happened on July 14th, a Wednesday afternoon, when the temperature had climbed past 95 degrees and the air hung thick enough to cut. Abraham had been inspecting the tobacco fields, walking the rows with his overseer to assess the crop's readiness for harvest. They'd been discussing labor allocation for the coming weeks when Abraham noticed something was cooking his pond. Dutch H. Rick seemed nervous, kept steering the conversation away from questions about night supervision of the curing process. Abraham had built his fortune on attention to detail, on noticing the small discrepancies that revealed larger problems. He dismissed Rix and walked alone toward the curing barn, his boots raising small clouds of dust from the parched earth. The barn's main doors stood partially open to catch any hint of breeze. Abraham had been expecting to find Thomas reviewing the previous year's curing records, preparing for the imminent harvest. Instead, he heard children laughing. The sound stopped him completely. There shouldn't be children anywhere near the curing barn. It was strictly off-limits to everyone except Thomas and the senior workers. Abraham moved quietly toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from deeper within the barn's shadowy interior. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he saw the makeshift partition wall, saw the gap where Thomas had hung a curtain made from old flour sacks. What Abraham witnessed when he pulled that curtain aside would be described in his private letters with language that veered between rage and something approaching horror. Thomas sat at a rough wooden table with Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary, all of them eating from actual plates. Not the tin dishes allocated to enslaved people, but ceramic plates from the main house. The 2-year-old boy was playing on the floor with carved wooden toys. The infant nursed at Rebecca's breast. On the wall, someone had hung a calendar where dates were marked with careful X's, as though this hidden family was tracking time like any normal household. Abraham's first word, according to Thomas's later testimony, was not an angry shout, but a whispered question.
There's something special about you. Your name's children. I want to go.
I want to leave now. I want to go back to before.
Perhaps I have an answer means of Barracks can help. Yes. Does the Vanguard watch the river? Europa is no longer the haven I hoped it would be. For those who do not wish to live under the rule of a dark Kelm, we must play Savior, a secret communications network would allow us to reach out.
Barracks, we're ready. Where is the first relay?
Barracks thanks you.
You know what it is when you got to spark up.
Power's going, Barracks.
Good. 2 more.
Okay, Barracks, that's 2.
How long?
Did
Thomas
you
stood slowly,
hear
placing
that?
himself between his father and
Sounded
his
like
mother.
voices.
18 months, he said. And I won't apologize for it. What
The
followed
ones who
wasn't
spoke
the
through me.
violent confrontation one might expect.
Must hurry.
Abraham Sutherland didn't strike
There's
his
one
son or
more
immediately
relay.
summon the overseer. Instead, he did something that Thomas later described as far more terrifying. He went completely still, his face draining of color, as he looked from his son to the women, to the children, and back. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat effect of someone calculating the scope of the disaster. "You've been greedy," Abraham said. "Like this was your property, you managed." Thomas tried to explain about his feelings for the women, about his plans to eventually free them, about how the situation was more complex than his father could understand. But Abraham wasn't listening. His mind was already working through the implications. It seemed not a human drama, but a tangle of legal and social problems that threatened to destroy everything he built. The enslaved women belonged to him. Not some. Each had informed to them of his property as well, assets on his plantation's ledger. But Thomas had been acting as their husband, a relationship that had no legal standing. It would be recognized by everyone in the county as a moral fact. If word of this spread, Abraham would become a laughingstock, the old fool who couldn't control his own son or his own property. Worse, there would be questions about what other irregularities existed at Holders. Questions that might attract unwanted attention from neighbors, from business associates, from the careful social networks that maintain power in antebellum Virginia. Stay here, Abraham finally said. All of you go through this bar. Don't speak to anyone. I need you think. Walk back to the main house in the blazing outline painted. His mind rose. In his study, he pulled out the plantation's record books, reviewing the entries for Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary. Each was listed with her age, her skills, her approximate value. Beside Rebecca's name, someone, probably Thomas, had added a small notation with different ink. Here we go. Excellent productivity. Abraham stared at those words, recognizing his son's handwriting, realizing that Thomas had been slowly inserting these women into the official records as valuable workers, probably planning to eventually request their purchase or transfer. The audacity of it was almost impressive.
I love growing with the neighborhood. We have customers from all over the world. It's like a cultural hub. Everyone is accepted here and embraced here.
Pizza! Those sandwiches! You can settle this with a sibling cage match, or Jimmy Johnson toasted pizza sandwich. Look, me, Mom. This is win-win! Toasted pizza sandwiches with Jimmy Johnson. Oh, that's good.
Abraham sat at his desk until well after dark, occasionally making notes on a sheet of paper, crossing out ideas, writing. The house slave reported later that he didn't call for dinner, didn't have more than a single handful. They heard him talking to himself once, a short burst of words none of them could make out clearly. By morning, Abraham Southern Thurland had made his decision. It would be a decision that shocked everyone who learned of it. A decision that would be argued about in Chesterfield County for generations. They put in Abraham's calculation. It was the only solution that gave him any chance of controlling the scandal, of turning. The announcement came to breakfast the following morning, delivered to Thomas in the main house's dining room with the same tone Abraham used to discuss crop yields or equipment purchases. "You will marry her," Abraham said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. All three. "The ceremony will be Saturday at noon in the courthouse square. I've already sent word to Reverend Thomas stared at his father, certain he whispered. "That's impossible. Virginia law doesn't recognize. I'm aware of what Virginia
During the Golden Age, it was
Abraham
humans.
correct. The
Now,
marriages won't be
it's the
legally
fallen.
binding, but they will be
I
public.
don't get it.
Every planter in
Why
the
would
county
anyone want
will
to live
witness
here?
my son taking responsibility for his actions, standing before God and community to declare these women as his wives. It's the only way to control what people will say, the only way to establish that this wasn't mere exploitation. The calculation behind Abraham's plan was both brilliant and deeply cynical. By forcing a public ceremony, he would preempt the worst gossip, establishing a narrative of irregular but acknowledged commitment rather than casual abuse. The story would become about his son's strange idealism, his foolish notions about enslaved women. Troubling, yes, but contained within the framework of a young man's errors. More importantly, by making the marriages public but legally void, Abraham maintained actual ownership of the women and children. They would remain his property, assets he could manage, sell, or dispose of as he saw fit. Thomas's protests were immediate and vehement. The ceremony would humiliate the women, would reduce their relationship to a public spectacle, but Abraham had anticipated every objection. He wanted them acknowledged, he said coldly. He wanted their children to have standing. This gives them matter as close as they'll ever get in Virginia. The alternative is I sell all three tomorrow morning to a cotton trader heading to Mississippi, and you never see them or those children again. Your choice. It wasn't a choice at all, and both men knew it. The next 3 days passed in a strange suspended atmosphere at Hollis. Abraham had Beatrix move Thomas and the women into one of the guest rooms in the main house. A tactical decision that kept them under observation while also beginning the process of legitimizing their presence. Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary walked through the house's public spaces in a kind of daze, wearing clothes that had been pulled from storage, sitting at the dining table for meals while other enslaved people served them. The cognitive dissonance was profound and deliberate. They were being
Not that I
treated
think
as
I can't
family
handle
members
it.
while
I
remaining
know I
Chad
can.
elevated and degraded
I
in the
just
same
wish we had a
breath.
better idea
Abraham
of what
spent
that
those
might be.
days visiting neighboring
We're definitely
plantations,
in uncharted
personally
territory
delivering
out here.
invitations to the Saturday ceremony. His approach was carefully calibrated. He presented the wedding as an eccentricity, an indulgence of his son's peculiar sensibilities that nevertheless demonstrated Thomas's willingness to take responsibility. The boy's got notions, Abraham would say, shaking his head with practiced resignation. But at least he's standing up before God and community. How many young men can say that these days? The responses vary. Some planters laugh, seeing the whole thing as an elaborate joke at Thomas's expense. Others were more disturbed, sensing implications they couldn't quite articulate. A few refused the invitation outright, considering the entire spectacle beneath their dignity. But Abraham had predicted that most would attend out of sheer curiosity. And he was right. By Friday evening, it was clear that Courthouse Square would be packed. In town, Reverend Marcus Talbot struggled with his own crisis of conscience. The 52-year-old minister had served Chesterfield County's Episcopal congregation for nearly 2 decades, presiding over countless weddings that reinforced the social order of Plantation, Virginia. What Abraham Sutherland was asking him to do existed in a gray area that made him deeply uncomfortable. The ceremonies wouldn't be legally binding, he'd been assured of that, but they would carry spiritual weight, his participation lending the proceedings a religious legitimacy that felt dangerous. Talbot met with Abraham twice during those 3 days, trying to find some way to refuse, without directly challenging a man who contributed substantially to the church's finances. Abraham was prepared for this too, framing the issue in terms the Reverend couldn't easily dismiss. Weren't these women's souls worth saving? Wasn't it better to bring them into the Christian covenant through marriage, even a regular marriage, than to leave them in sin? And wasn't Thomas showing more moral courage than most young men of his class by publicly acknowledging his responsibilities? The arguments were specious, of course, twisting theology to serve Abraham's pragmatic ends, but they gave Talbot enough cover to agree. He would perform the ceremonies, he decided, because the alternative, leaving these women and children completely outside any social or spiritual recognition, seemed worse. On Friday night, Thomas sat with Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary in the guest room, trying to explain what would happen the next decade.
Don't compromise quality insurance for savings or your time for this ad. Hit that skip button. Or don't. Watch me skip.
In there. Yes. Yes.
We are partners.
This is the most gruesome murder I've ever seen.
Johnson, what's the motive looking like in this?
I'm Robert. Who are you guys supposed to be? The Forensic team is off playing the new Call of Duty Black Ops 7. We're their replacement. Oh my God!
No, he's now. I'll do that thing here. But touch everything.
They'd all agreed to go through with it, not because they believed it would change their status in any meaningful way, but because the alternative Abraham threatened was unbearable. Still, the reality of standing in the town square, of being displayed before the county's white population, filled them with a dread that went beyond ordinary fear. We knew Virginia after this, Thomas promised, but we had no clear plan. We'll find a way. Maybe Ohio, maybe Pennsylvania. Somewhere you'll be free. Mary, the youngest, touched her swollen belly. And we'll be back. We'll be where it matters. Thomas nodded, believing it himself, even though every practical consideration argued against it. The fantasy was all we had left alone. Saturday morning arrived with the sky like fleeting grass, the sun already flashing by 8 o'clock. Abraham rose early, dressing in his finest black suit, checking his appearance in the mirror with the same attention he did before it was. Because that's what this was really, a negotiation with his community, an attempt to dictate the terms of his family scandal before it could dictate its own. At Hollowism, the house slaves had been instructed to prepare the women, for the ceremony. They helped Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary into dresses that had belonged to Thomas's mother, white cotton gowns that had been hastily altered to fit. The symbolism was heavy-handed, but deliberate. Abraham wanted the visual language of traditional weddings, wanted to anchor this irregular spectacle in recognizable form. The women stood before a mirror together, looking at their reflections, seeing themselves transformed into brides in a mockery that somehow felt more cruel than any direct violence. Thomas wore a dark suit and held himself with a rigid formality that masked his terror. He barely slept and spent the night alternating between anger at his father and fear for the women he dragged into this situation. As they prepared to leave for town, he pulled Sarah aside. "If you want to run," he whispered, "I won't blame you. I won't blame you what you do. I can create a distraction." Sarah cut him off, her voice low and certain. "We're going. We're standing up there with you because maybe this crazy thing your father's doing actually means something. Maybe people will see us and have to think about what we are, who we are. Maybe that's worth more than hiding." It was either profound courage or profound delusion. Thomas couldn't tell which. The wagon ride into town took 40 minutes. Abraham sitting up front with Thomas, the 3 women, and 2 children in the back, with a house slave named Peter, who'd been instructed to keep watch. They passed other plantations, past enslaved people working in fields who stopped to stare at the strange procession. Word had spread, of course it had, and people were already speculating about what would happen in Courthouse Square. As they approached the town, Thomas could see that the square was already filled with spectators. Courthouse Square sat at the heart of Chesterfield, dominated by a red brick courthouse with a small bell tower. A raised platform stood before the courthouse steps, typically used for auctions and public notices. That's where the ceremony would take place, elevated so everyone could witness it clearly. Abraham had thought of everything. Even the choice of location carried meaning. This wasn't a church wedding, sacred and private, but a civic event, public and enforceable by community judgment, if not by law. The wagon rolled to a stop at the square's edge. Abraham climbed down first, then turned to help the women descend, playing the role of solicitor's father-in-law with practiced ease. Thomas followed, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he took Sarah's arm, then Rebecca's, then Mary's. They stood together at the platform's base, and Thomas could feel hundreds of eyes on them, could hear the murmur of the crowd like distant thunder.
My moderate to severe Crohn's symptoms kept me out of the picture. With Skyrizi, feel symptom relief at 4 weeks. Many people were in remission at 12 weeks, at 1 year, and even at 3 years.
Don't use allergic. Serious allergic reactions, increased infections, or lower ability to fight that may occur. Before treatment, get checked for infections and TB. Tell your doctor about any flu-like symptoms or vaccines. Liver problems leading to hospitalization may occur when treated for Crohn's.
Ask your gastroenterologist about Skyrizi.
LegalZoom helps you build your LLC. Visit LegalZoom.
Reverend Talbot stood on the platform in his ceremonial robes, the Bible open in his hands, his expression carefully neutral. Behind him, 3 county officials had gathered, the clerk, the sheriff, and the magistrate. Not as participants, but as witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. Their presence gave the event an official weight that transcended mere spectacle. Abraham led the group up the platform steps, positioning them with the same attention he'd give to arranging furniture. Thomas stood in the center with Sarah on his right, Rebecca, and Mary to his left. The children, 2-year-old Samuel and 6-month-old Grace, were held by Peter, who stood at the platform's far edge, visible but separate. Abraham took his own position slightly behind, and to the side, a patriarch overseeing his family's strange ritual. The crowd pressed closer, perhaps 400 people packed into the square. Thomas recognized neighboring planters and farmers, town merchants, craftsmen, and in the back, beyond the white spectators, a large group of enslaved people who'd been given permission to witness the ceremony. Their presence was crucial to Abraham's plan. This needed to be seen by everyone, needed to become a story that would be told and retold in precisely the way Abraham controlled. Reverend Talbot cleared his throat, and the crowd's murmur faded to expectant silence. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice carrying across the square in the sight of God, "and this community to witness an unusual covenant. Thomas Sutherland has come before us to declare his commitment to these three women to acknowledge them before heaven and earth. The Reverend was walking a careful line, using the language of marriage without explicitly calling it that, invoking spiritual authority while avoiding legal specifics. He continued with a brief sermon about responsibility, about the duties men owe to those under their protection, about Christ's teachings regarding the least among us. It was theologically sound enough to provide cover, while remaining vague enough to mean almost anything. Then came the vows themselves, and here the ceremony veered into territory that made even the most sympathetic spectators uncomfortable. Thomas Summer threw untold tone. Do you take Sarah as your wife to care for her in sickness and health, to provide for her wants, to acknowledge before God and community your bond with her? Thomas's voice cracked slightly. I do. Do you take Rebecca as your wife to care for her in sickness, to provide for her wants, to acknowledge before God and community your bond with her? I do. Do you take Mary as your wife to care for her in sickness and health, to provide for her wants, to acknowledge before God and community your bond with her? I do. The Reverend turned to each woman in sequence, asking if they accepted Thomas as their husband, if they entered this covenant willingly. Each answered yes, their voices steady, despite the hundreds of staring eyes. Sarah's yes carried defiance. Rebecca's carried resignation. Mary's carried something that might have been hope. When the vows were complete, Colbert closed his Bible and raised his hands. Before God and this community, I declare these bonds acknowledged. May the Lord have mercy on all involved. It wasn't, you will kiss the bride. It wasn't, I now pronounce you man and wife. The language was deliberately ambiguous, recognizing something without quite naming it. And yet, legally void where they were, those vows had been witnessed by 400 people. They existed now as social fact, undeniable and permanent. Abraham stepped forward with 4 documents he had prepared. Marriage certificates drafted by a lawyer from Richmond, carefully worded to acknowledge the ceremony without claiming legal status. The county clerk had been instructed to sign as witness, creating a paper trail that existed in official records without constituting actual marriage licenses. It was a bureaucratic magic trick, giving the appearance of legitimacy while remaining legally void. As the clerk signed each document, a voice rang out from the crowd. This is an abomination. Its turn. The speaker was Harrison Caldwell, owner of an adjacent plantation and one of Abraham's longtime business rivals. Caldwell pushed through the crowd toward the platform, his face flushed with rage. You've made a mockery of marriage, Southern Third. These creatures are property, not wives. You've degraded your family. You've degraded all of us by forcing us to witness this travesty. Abraham had been expecting a physician, but Caldwell's timing was unfortunate. Before Abraham could respond, another voice joined the argument. This one from Joseph Brennan, a younger planter known for his religious fervor. Actually, Brennan called, his voice carrying unexpected authority. What we've witnessed was a man taking responsibility. How many here can say their sons haven't taken advantage of enslaved women? At least Thomas Sutherland stands before us honestly. The crowd erupted into argument. Some men shouted agreement with Caldwell, calling the ceremony a disgrace. Others, perhaps uncomfortable with the implications for their own households, defended Abraham's approach as practical. Women in the crowd whispered urgently to each other, their faces reflecting a complex mix of scandal, sympathy, and vicarious horror. On the platform, Thomas felt Sarah's hand grip his own. He looked at her and saw tears streaming down her face, not from fear or shame, but from something else entirely. Later, she would tell him that in that moment, listening to white men argue about her humanity, she felt herself become real in a way she never had before. The ceremony might be legally void, but it had forced everyone present to confront the cognitive dissonance at the heart of their society. Abraham raised his hands, calling for silence. When the crowd finally quieted, he spoke with the commanding presence of a man used to being obeyed. What happens in my family is my concern, he said firmly. I brought you here because I believe in transparency and handling difficult matters before the community. Thomas has made choices I don't approve of, but he's standing here taking responsibility like a man. That's more than can be said for many young people these days. The world may never know.
Start your day with Cultural Digestive Daily Probiotic.
It works naturally with your body to support digestion and immune defenses. Keep you going all day long. Culturelle Probiotic. Every day, every body.
This ceremony is done. The marriages are acknowledged. Now we all return to our affairs. It was a dismissal, clear and final. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse. Though not knots of people remained to argue, to speculate, to process what they witnessed. Thomas helped the women down from the platform, acutely aware that everything had changed. They were married in the eyes of 400 witnesses, but still enslaved in the eyes of the law. The return to Hollis should have been a relief, but instead it marked the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. Abraham's grand gesture had indeed controlled the immediate narrative, but it had also created a set of consequences he had to anticipate. The first problem emerged within days of the ceremony. Abraham had intended the public marriage to establish boundaries, to make clear that Thomas's relationships were now proper and therefore contained, but several neighboring planters thought differently. If enslaved women could be publicly married to their owner's son, what did that mean for the status of any enslaved person? The ceremony had inadvertently suggested that enslaved people could enter contracts, could make choices that carried social weight, could exist as parties to agreements rather than as mere property. The delegation arrived at Hollis on Tuesday, led by Harrison Caldwell and two other major landowners. They met with Abraham and Scully, and their message was blunt. The ceremony had been a mistake that was causing unrest on their own plantation. Enslaved people were asking questions, wondering if they too could have their relationships recognized, if their families might be protected from separation. The social order required clear boundaries, and Abraham had blurred them dangerously. Abraham tried to explain his reasoning, but Caldwell cut him off. You've opened a door, southern Verland, and now every one of us will have to deal with what walks through. He'd solved one problem while creating several others. Meanwhile, in the main house, Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary were discovering the reality of their new status. Abraham had moved them into the guest wing permanently, insisted they take meals with the family, and forbidden them from performing manual labor. On the surface, this seemed like elevation, but it was really isolation. The other enslaved people at Hollis didn't know how to treat them. They were still slaves, but they'd been married to the master's son in front of the entire county. They were to be respected, resented. The resulting tension poisoned the atmosphere. Worse, white society had effectively shunned them. Women who might have visited Holocrest to pay social calls now avoided it. Thomas and his three wives existed in a social void, acknowledged but not accepted, visible but not seen. Visible but not seen. Thomas spent his days trying to maintain some semblance of normal, teaching Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary all advanced reading, discussing with them his still vague plans for escape to the north. But the plans felt increasingly hopeless. They had no money. Abraham controlled all finances. They had no connections outside Virginia, and now, after the public ceremony, they were under constant observation. Abraham had summoned Peter to essentially guard them, ostensibly for their protection, but really to prevent any attack on the Then in early August, something happened that would crack open the careful stability Abraham had tried to impose. Mary went into labor 3 weeks early, her body racked with complications from the stress of the previous weeks. The birth was difficult, attended by an enslaved midwife named Ruth, who delivered dozens of babies at Hollow Crest. For 12 hours, Mary struggled while Thomas paced outside the room, listening to her screams and feeling utterly powerless. Sarah and Rebecca stayed with her, holding her hands, whispering encouragement. The child, a girl Mary named Elizabeth, survived, but Mary didn't. She died an hour after the birth, her body simply giving out after too much trauma, too much strain. Ruth said later it was exhaustion, as much as any physical complication that Mary's spirit had been fighting back, her body couldn't sustain. Thomas held Mary's cooling hand and wept like a child while Abraham stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. The death changed something fundamental. This wasn't abstract anymore. Wasn't about property or social standing or family legacy. A 20-year-old woman had died, leaving behind a newborn daughter, and she died because Thomas had loved her, and Abraham had made them all perform in a public spectacle. The funeral was small, held in the enslaved people's cemetery at the edge of Holrest's property. Reverend Talbert came at Thomas's insistence, though Abraham opposed it. The minister said brief words over Mary's grave, and Thomas stood between Sarah and Rebecca, holding baby Elizabeth, understanding for the first time the full weight of what his fantasy of love and family had cost. That night, Thomas went to his father's study. He didn't knock, just walked in and found Abraham sitting at his desk, reviewing accounts as though nothing had happened. "This is your fault," Thomas said, his voice low. "Your ceremony killed her." Abraham looked up, his expression tired. "The ceremony didn't kill her. Childbirth killed her. It happens. It's tragic, but it happens. You paraded her like an animal. You forced her to stand in front of hundreds of people while pregnant, made her an object of mockery. I made her visible." Abraham's voice rose suddenly. "Before that ceremony, she was nothing. No one. At least I gave her recognition, gave her child a father who acknowledges her. Don't you dare blame me for trying to salvage your disaster." They stared at each other across the desk, and Thomas saw clearly that his father would never understand, could never see these women as fully human. The ceremony, for all its apparent acknowledgement, had been just another form of ownership, another way of controlling property. "I'm leaving," Thomas said quietly. "I'm taking Sarah, Rebecca, and the children, and we're going north." Abraham's laugh was bitter. "With what money? What plan? You can't even get to Richmond without being stopped. They're my property, Thomas. Legally mine. Try to take them, and I'll have the sheriff bring them back before you reach the county." It was true, Thomas knew it. The marriage certificates Abraham had created were memories outside the specific context of that ceremony. They didn't grant freedom, didn't change legal ownership, didn't provide any protection at all.
Those who answer the call of the vagabond know the best stories aren't about where you went. They're about who got there. Because they know the real destination is the adventure itself. Firestone for those who answer the call of the vagabond.
They were theater, nothing more. Thomas left the study without another word, and returned to the room he now shared with Sarah and Rebecca. He found them sitting together, Rebecca nursing Elizabeth while Sarah held young Samuel. They looked up at him with eyes that held no illusions about their situation. "We're trapped," Sarah said softly. "It wasn't a question." Thomas nodded. "But I'll find a way. I promise I'll find a way." What came next unfolded over several months. A slow escalation that would ultimately force a confrontation none of them anticipated. In September, Abraham received a letter from a cotton planter in Alabama, a man named Charles Weather, who heard about the Chesterfield ceremony through the network of correspondence that connected slaveholders across the South. Weatherby's letter was polite and pointed. He was interested in purchasing Rebecca and her daughter Grace, along with Sarah and Samuel, if they could be induced to come as well. He'd pay above market value, understanding that the situation at Holocrest was delicate. Abraham didn't tell Thomas about the letter immediately. Instead, he considered the offer seriously. The ceremony had achieved its goal of preventing immediate scandal, but it had left him with an ongoing problem. As long as Sarah and Rebecca remained at Hollows, they would be sources of tension, reminders of his family's irregular arrangement. Selling them would resolve that, would restore a kind of normality, and Weatherby's offer was genuinely generous. When Abraham finally showed Thomas the letter in late September, the confrontation was explosive. Thomas threatened to expose everything, to go public with the exact nature of the ceremony, to destroy what remained of Abraham's reputation. Abraham responded by threatening to separate the children from their mothers, to sell each to different buyers, so Thomas could never find them all again. The standoff revealed the fundamental truth of their situation. Abraham held all the actual power, and Thomas had nothing but emotional leverage that could be crushed at any moment. "Sarah, over here."
I owe your thirst for the fight. Come and fight
I
me.
made a decision. That night, she met
And sending her
secretly with
location
Peter,
to us.
the man Abraham
Looks
had
like
signed
we won
the
ourselves an invitation.
Peter had grown up at Holloist, had known Thomas since they were boys, and the ceremony had affected him in ways he hadn't expected. Watching Sarah, Rebecca, and Mary stand on that platform had made him think differently about his own family, about the woman he lived with, and their children who could be sold away. "Will you help us now?" Sarah asked him. Peter considered this for a long time. "Where would you go, Zevsburg or Ohio? Thomas has a cousin in Cincinnati who's sympathetic to." She hesitated, using the careful language necessary for such conversations to people seeking their freedom. "If we can reach him, he might help us get to Canada. Mr. Abraham will come after you. We'll spend whatever it takes." "I know, but we have to try." Peter nodded slowly. "I'll help, but we need resources. Money, travel papers, connections. Can't just run blind into the night." What followed was a conspiracy more intricate than anything Thomas could have conceived alone. Peter reached out to a network he'd quietly maintained for years. Enslaved people and free blacks who helped runaway slaves move north. Sarah began stealing small amounts of cash from household accounts, taking only amounts small enough not to be immediately noticed. Rebecca made contact with a Quaker merchant in Richmond who was known to sympathize with abolitionists, trading sewing work for information about safe routes and sympathetic contacts. Through October and November, they planned while maintaining the appearance of compliance. Thomas played his part by pretending to accept his father's authority by appearing defeated and resigned. Abraham, believing he'd won, relaxed his vigilance slightly. The planning required extraordinary caution. Every conversation had to appear casual, every meeting coincidental. Sarah developed a system of leaving notes hidden in the main house's library, tucked between pages of books she knew Thomas would consult. Rebecca used her trips to the smokehouse as opportunities to meet with Peter, who would update her on progress with the underground contacts. They communicated in fragments, in half-sentences, always aware that discovery would mean not just the end of their escape plans, but likely their sail to the deep south is finished. Thomas had to maintain his facade of resignation while secretly gathering what resources he could. He sold his watch, a graduation gift from his mother, to a merchant in town, claiming he needed cash for a private matter. He liquidated a small trust his maternal grandfather had left him. Money Abraham didn't control, withdrawing it in increments small enough not to raise a loss. Every dollar went into a leather pouch Sarah kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In early December, Joseph Brennan, the younger planter who defended the ceremony back in July, approached Thomas privately after a church service. Brennan's own conscience had been troubled by what he'd witnessed, and he'd been corresponding with Northern abolitionists about the moral implications of slavery. He offered Thomas something precious: forged travel papers, identifying Sarah and Rebecca as free women of color, along with $200. "I can't make this right," Brennan told Thomas, his voice low. They stood behind the church, ostensibly discussing price prices while conducting a transaction with the gift of prison. "But I must. These papers are good. Made by a man in Philadelphia who knows his craft. They'll pass inspection unless you're terribly unlucky." Thomas took the documents with trembling hands, understanding that Brennan was risking everything by helping him. "Why are you doing this?" Brennan's expression was pain. "Because I stood on that platform in July and told myself your father was doing something honorable. But I've spent these months thinking about what I've really witnessed. A man trying to turn human beings into a solution to his social embarrassment. I can't undo my part in it, but I can help you undo his." The forged papers were remarkable in their attention to detail. They identified Sarah as Sarah Freeman, free woman of color, born in Richmond, Virginia, 1822, and Rebecca as Rebecca Williams, free woman of color, born in Petersburg, Virginia, 1825.
General, how many weeks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll Center of the Tootsie Pop?
I never made it with that by now. Ask Mr. Owl.
Mr. Owl, how many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll Center of a Tootsie Pop?
Let's find out. 1, 2, 3. 3. How many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll Center of the Tootsie Pop?
The words
They never know.
Each document included a physical description, a notarized
I didn't even look while I was doing that.
dated several years earlier, and travel permits allowing them to move freely through Virginia and beyond. The forgeries wouldn't withstand deep scrutiny, but for casual inspection by a sheriff or a railroad conductor, they would likely suffice. The escape plan crystallized. They would leave during the Christmas season when travel was common and less suspicious. Peter knew a steamboat captain who could take them to Richmond for a price, and from Richmond they could take trains home, using the forged papers to pass as a white man, traveling with his free employees and their children. The captain, a man named Dutch Bailiff, who'd been running the James River route for 15 years, had helped other fugitives, though always for substantial payment. Peter negotiated a price, $40 to get the group to Richmond with no questions asked. The plan had dozens of points where it could fail. A suspicious neighbor might spot them leaving. Abraham might discover their absence sooner than expected. The forged papers might not hold up to inspection. Dutch Vera might betray them for a reward. Any sheriff between Virginia and Ohio might decide to investigate more closely. And even if they reached Canada, there was always the risk of slave catchers crossing the border, of being discovered and dragged back in chains. But staying meant certain separation. Sarah and Rebecca knew that once they were sold to Alabama, they would never see Thomas again, never see each other again, and their children would grow up in bondage with no hope of eventual freedom. As December progressed, the tension at Holocaust became almost unbearable. Abraham, meanwhile, had received 2 more letters from Alabama, Weatherby getting impatient about the purchase, raising his offer to an amount that Abraham found hard to refuse. The final offer was $3,000 for Sarah and Samuel, $2,500 for Rebecca and Grace. It was well above market value, reflecting both the women's skills and Weatherby's eagerness to close the deal. Abraham decided he would conclude the sale in early January, would tell Thomas after it was done, would deal with his son's rage and grief, and ultimately break him to his will. Abraham wrote back to Weatherby accepting the offer and inviting him to visit Hollis during the Christmas season to inspect his purchase and finalize the paperwork. The letter was sent on December 15th, and Weatherby's response came within a week. He would arrive on December 23rd and expected to complete the transaction by Christmas Day, taking his new property back to Alabama before the new year. Everything came to a head on December 23rd, 1847. Abraham had invited Weatherby to visit Hollis to inspect the property he intended for purchase. The Alabama planter arrived on Tuesday morning with his business agent, and Abraham gave them a tour of the plantation, discussing productivity metrics and health records with the detached professionalism of a livestock dealer. Weatherby was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a thin face and a booming voice that carried across Holocrest grounds. His agent, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Cookie, took detailed notes, examining Sarah and Rebecca from a distance as they worked in the main house. Abraham planned to formally introduce Weatherby to Sarah and Rebecca that afternoon to let the Alabama planter confirm that they matched his requirements and expectations. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m., 0 in the main house's drawing room. Thomas learned about the visit when he saw the strangers walking the grounds with his father. Peter came to him with urgent whispers. "They're here to buy them. Your father said." I heard Mr. Abraham talking with that heavy man about transport arrangements to Alabama. The realization hit Thomas like a physical blow. After everything, the ceremony, Mary's death, the months of tense coexistence, his father was going to do exactly what he threatened. Sarah and Rebecca would be torn away, sent to Alabama, where Thomas would never see them again, where any possibility of eventual freedom would die in the brutal cotton fields of the Deep South. Thomas found Sarah in the kitchen house, ostensibly supervising the preparation of dinner for Abraham's guests. She looked at him and immediately understood. "Landry," she asked quietly, "he's introducing you to the buyer at 2 Cool, 0. The sale will be finalized tomorrow or the next day." Sally's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "Then we leave tonight. No more waiting. No more planning. Whatever we have, it's enough." Thomas wanted to argue that they needed more time, more preparation, but he knew she was right. In 24 hours, Sarah and Rebecca might be in chains being transported to Alabama. Any delay was futile. He found Rebecca in the nursery caring for the 3 children. When you told her, she simply laughed. I've been ready since October, we all have. At 1:30, Thomas went to his father's study where Abraham was preparing documents for the sale, bills of sale, transfer certificates, health attestations, all the bureaucratic machinery that turns human beings into commodities. Their confrontation was brief but definitive.
This is Joseph Wheatland. Today, he's driving every lap with Shell Renewable Race Fuel, reducing race fuel emissions by 60% with all NTT IndyCar Series races. Shell, powering everybody forward.
There's something special about you.
We'll leave now. A wonderful crash. Before.
You can't do this, Thomas said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. Those marriages were public. You made them public. 400 people watched. Those marriages are legal fictions. Abraham interrupted coldly, not even looking up from his papers. Useful theater. The women are my property, and I'll dispose of them as I see fit. I've indulged your attachment for nearly 6 months, but that indulgence ends now. Revere is a good man who will treat them well, and they'll be more useful on his cotton operation than they are here, causing disruption. They're my wives. You stood there and watched me vow to care for them. I watched you participate in a ceremony designed to prevent scandal. It succeeded in that purpose. But those vows have no legal standing. This conversation is pointless, Thomas. Weatherby signs the papers tomorrow morning. The women and children leave on Friday. That's fine. Thomas felt something break inside him. Some last connection to the man who raised him. Then you never meant anything. The ceremony, the acknowledgement, the certificates, it was all just another form of control. Abraham finally looked up, his eyes cold and certain. Everything is controlled. That's the lesson you failed to learn. I control this plantation. I control the people on it. And yes, I control you. However, once you've learned that your romantic notions have no place in the real world, this will hurt for a while, but you'll survive. Men always do. And the children, Samuel and Grace. You're going to separate them from their mothers' families. Send them into cotton slavery before they're old enough to remember anything else. They're young. They'll adapt. Weatherby assures me he doesn't separate children from their mothers until they're at least 10. That's more consideration than many fear. The casual cruelty. The calm calculation made Thomas understand that no argument, no appeal to conscience or humanity would change his father's mind. Abraham had made his decision based on pragmatic considerations, profit, social order, control. The ceremony in July had been a tactical move in a larger strategy. Nothing more. Thomas walked out of the study and found Sarah, Rebecca, and Peter waiting for him in the hall. They'd been listening, understanding from the tone, if not the exact words, that time had run out. We leave tonight, Thomas said, his voice steady. Emptied of everything except determination. Now, before he can stop us, the afternoon dissolved into careful chaos. While Abraham entertained Weatherman cooking in the main house, showing them plantation records, and discussing the terms of transport to Alabama, Thomas and the others executed the final stage of their plan with desperate precision. Peter brought the wagon around to the back of the property, loading it with supplies they'd been accumulating for weeks: food, blankets, a change of clothes for each person, the leather pouch with their saved money, the forged papers Brennan had divided. Sarah and Rebecca dressed the children warmly, multiple layers against the December cold. Thomas packed his single bag with essentials, including the marriage certificates over. He waited. He took them not because they had legal value, but because they were proof that what had happened in Courthouse Square was real, was witnessed, could not be easily erased. The hardest moment came when Sarah had to say goodbye to Ruth, the midwife who delivered all 3 children, and who'd become something like a mother to her. They met briefly in the kitchen house, and Ruth held Sarah's hands tightly. "You're doing right," Ruth whispered. "Running is dangerous, but staying is death. You take care of those babies, and you remember you're stronger than anything they can do to you." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. And then she was gone, moving quickly toward the wagon where the others waited. They left Hollis at 7:30, just after full dark, driving the wagon through the back fields toward a road that would take them to Richmond. Peter guided, using his knowledge of the county's back roads to avoid main thoroughfares where they might be spotted. The night was bitterly cold, the temperature dropping toward freezing, thin clouds obscured the moon, providing cover, but making navigation treacherous. Samuel, the 2-year-old, kept asking where they were going, his voice carrying the still air. Sarah held him close, whispering reassurances while her heart hammered with fear that someone would hear. Baby Grace slept in Rebecca's arms, mercifully quiet. Elizabeth, Mary's daughter, was still too young to understand anything, except that the adults around her were tense and frightened. They made good time through the back country, Peter pushing the horses as fast as he dared without risking injury to the animals or drawing attention. Every sound made them freeze. A dog barking in the distance. The creak of another wagon somewhere in the darkness. The hoot of an owl that might or might not be a human signal. The forged papers were hidden in Thomas's coat, but they all knew that papers wouldn't help if they were caught actually running. If Abraham's men found them before they could establish their cover story. Abraham didn't discover they were gone until nearly 9:00 when a servant went to call Thomas for dinner and found his room empty. The initial confusion turned to alarm when Abraham realized Sarah and Rebecca were missing as well, along with the children.